celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I would like to welcome you to our annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. program. Each year we have one or two keynote speakers on campus during this special week, and we're very privileged to have those same individuals in to be on our program of the North Idaho College Public Forum. At this year's Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we had two keynote speakers, and I welcome those gentlemen to our program. First of all, to my far left is Mr. Bill Wasmuth, who is now the Executive Director of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. Bill, before taking that position, is the former president of the Northwest Coalition, and he also is the former president of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, and has served on many boards and groups when he, for 9 years, was in Coeur d'Alene, and he now is based in Seattle. Bill, once again, welcome back to our program.
Thanks, Tony.
I'm also very delighted to have, for the very first time on our program since he was elected to the United States House of Representatives, Congressman Larry LaRocco from the 1st Congressional District of the state of Idaho. Before becoming the congressman from the 1st District, Mr. LaRocco was a successful stockbroker for 8 years in Boise. Prior to that, he was best known in North Idaho as the Idaho Field Director for the late Senator Frank Church. He also in the U.S. House serves on the House Interior Committee and the House Banking Committee. Congressman LaRocco, welcome to the program.
It's good to be with you, Tony.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, to be with me in questioning our guest today on the subject of human rights and the celebration of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Janelle, please commence the questioning.
Well, as Tony has noted, it is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That's a national and a state holiday. Congressman LaRocco, what is the need for such a holiday? Hasn't everything been fixed?
No, it hasn't been fixed, and there's a dramatic need for this holiday, both in Idaho and in the nation. If we're not familiar with our past, we're bound to repeat the mistakes of the past. So as we look ahead, we must look behind, and especially to the life of this incredible man who spoke about nonviolence and equal rights. Our country isn't very old, but it was only a few years ago, during the time that he was alive, that we are still striving for equal rights in this country on many fronts. He taught us how to pursue those goals in a nonviolent way. And I think it's very important for generations of young people to look to our past, as it is to look to our past in conflicts like Vietnam. And this was a violent period in our time when people were assassinated during the 60s. And so we have to look behind to our past. And it's fitting and appropriate that we look at his life.
And so that's a kind of a day set aside to focus precisely on this issue and what it means to all of us.
Exactly, and what has happened on the campus of North Idaho College is what's happening all over the country, where people are focusing on his life, and in the schools, and they're doing preparation to review his life, and that's a good sign for America, that we have a healthy democracy and government that can focus on somebody who really taught us a lot about nonviolence and human rights and equal rights.
Well, Bill, what about in a state like Idaho or in a region like the Pacific Northwest? What is happening? What is the state of affairs with regard to human rights in this area? And do we have problems here too?
Most certainly. 545 incidents of malicious harassment as documented by the Monitoring Committee of the Northwest Coalition in the 5 northwestern states during a 12-month period of time. That's our most recent report. That represents an increase of 70% over the 12-month time previous to that. Part of that increase is more sensitivity and better reporting, but part of the increase also is simply there are more incidents of harassment happening day by day in the Northwest as across the country. And we know that that 545 is not all of them by any means. There are many more than that we aren't seeing. So yes, there's still very much harassment. There's a lot of harassment out there. That is increasing at the present time. I think that's reflective of some of the fears and anxieties and divisions that are happening amongst people in the Northwest as well as around the country. We desperately need the vision of Martin Luther King and to be reminded of that vision. both because we seem to be increasing in the amount of tension that we're experiencing and that resulting in supremacist groups or in malicious harassment incidents, but also because many who are on the right track or of the right heart on this issue are involved in so many other concerns and so many other issues that unless we have something like Martin Luther King birthday holiday each year to remind ourselves and to call a renewed energy and renewed commitment and renewed focus to his vision and the process which he used to achieve that vision, unless we have that reminder, we miss. So for many reasons, we need this day, and it's a great day.
When we invited you both to our program, we asked you to take a look at human rights from a different time period. And Congressman LaRocco, I will start with you. What you shared with the audience today in a very effective way was human rights in the world today. And you went through a series of issues that you found encouraging. And so I really have a two-part question. First of all, what is encouraging in the world today for those who seek freedom and equality?
Well, what's encouraging, I think, is the democratization of the former Soviet Union, the peace that's developing in El Salvador, the peace negotiations that are moving ahead in the Middle East. I think that these are very positive developments on the world front.
And in relation to the other side of that coin, with still strife in society on our planet, what do you see as some of the greatest problems that threaten human rights today?
Well, ironically, I think some of the democratization that's going on could actually be a threat in a way. For example, with the forces of nationalism that could be developing in the Soviet Union and in those nation states, there could be a return to persecution of Russian Jews, for example. I just returned from a trip to Israel, and there's a great deal of concern about that. There are about 1 million Russian Jews who are seriously thinking about emigrating to the state of Israel, and for that very reason. So there could be that potential persecution there. And actually, as the world suffers some recession, there's always the opportunity to use scapegoats as these things develop. And so I think that it's a two-edged sword in a lot of ways, Tony.
I know I've heard you say that you're very encouraged that the totalitarian system of the Soviet Union has collapsed. And I know you've talked about how that creates some opportunities for democracy, but I also hear you saying that as those ethnic strifes may take place within Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, that is a problem. But I guess I have another part of that question. Sure. That is, what can we do as a country and in our policy to try to prevent that ethnic strife and persecution of minority groups in Eastern Europe, for example?
Well, let's use China as an example, if
Sure.
I may. Recently in Congress there was a resolution by Nancy Pelosi, a congresswoman from California, that said if we're going to grant the People's Republic of China most favored nation status, that we're going to give them a year to clean up their act in terms of human rights violations, the fact that they have people incarcerated in prisons with slave labor who are actually developing goods for export. Now, I think that that's where the United States of America can use its foreign policy might to correct a human rights violation. Now, we're giving them a year. We would give them a year to correct that. But I think it sends a strong message that it's not most favored nation status and free and open trade and open borders and perhaps an increase in their economic activity without a price. And I think it's a proper price to extract, especially when you look at the People's Republic of China and the violations going on there.
And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, her resolution, for example, it would even be strengthened now because they don't have, they have less support. As the communist system has collapsed other places, wouldn't such a resolution even be more effective in application today?
Absolutely. I think it would. I sit on the International Development and Monetary Policy Subcommittee of the Banking Committee. As we develop a quota increase, and I don't need to go into all the ins and outs of that, but basically we're giving them the authority they need to make loans and to export. We are holding the feet of certain countries to the fire with regard to human rights, and that we build that into our policies of becoming involved through the International Monetary Fund. And I think that there are many ways that we can do that as we see violations around the world.
Thank you. Bill Wasmuth, you today in your speech talked about the future, and you used the term visionary, and you identified a number of individuals that were leaders throughout history. Would you do two things for us? First, take us a little bit through that again for the TV audience, that and Dr. King being such a role model. Who are some of those people, and what have they done to help us on this path towards human rights?
So you want my 20-minute
Speech in
presentation
about 2 minutes.
in about 30 seconds. We can manage that, Tony. I was talking, and I really am firmly convinced about it, that we need to be dreamers. We need to be visionaries these days. And not just somehow idle daydreamers, but dreamers who are willing also then to make the commitment necessary to implement those dreams. And I think that commitment means giving up some old ways and taking the risk to practice some new ways, because I don't think the old ways are working all that well in many situations in our society and our world right now. And some of those dreamers I identified, Christopher Columbus, he was a dreamer. He headed out going west to find something east, and people thought he was a crazy dreamer. When he arrived here, the problem was that he brought with him some of the old paradigms and some of the old ways of doing things, of oppression and force and control. And so the dream turned into a nightmare for the people that he discovered in what was then termed to be called the Americas. Some 2 centuries, 3 centuries later, another group of dreamers got together and dreamt up the Constitution, if you want, of the United States, where all people would have justice and equality and freedom. And they implemented that and went to war for that, a revolutionary war. But unfortunately, and that did provide freedom for many people, and it was a good dream for many people, but there were still slaves. There were many in our society for whom that dream didn't fit. Abraham Lincoln came along as another dreamer, willing to risk and commit to broaden that dream for more people. And then in our own lifetime, Martin Luther King, who had a vision that said it's not just being free from slavery, it's having equal opportunity to justice. It's having equal treatment in this country. It's having equal opportunity for economic advancement, those kinds of things. And he was willing to establish a process of nonviolence, of respect for people, of respect for life, in order to implement that. He was willing to let go of some of the old ways and risk some new ways to implement the dream. I think that's the challenge for us in the future. I think to live as 5 billion plus people on this planet with some peace, with justice for all, it means we're going to have to give up some old patterns and some old paradigms and some old ways of doing things. We're going to have to be dreamers and be able to dream up new ways to implement those dreams to make them become reality if we're going to survive as a people.
I can never have you on this program without dealing with the advantage of your background in theology and philosophy. And now that you've said that so eloquently, what advice would you give to individuals who do play life safely and very cautiously, and individuals who have trouble challenging those systems and processes that do deny those principles that Dr. King espoused so eloquently?
I'm certainly not going to argue against a certain degree of caution. I think we all need to be cautious. But on the other hand, if we're going to live life, we need to live life. And life is opportunity, and life is taking some risk. And it seems to me that, especially in terms of our relationships with each other, as individuals, as nations, as societies, as peoples, as communities, in our relationships with others, caution there is often going to end up being voiced and expressed in terms of control, in terms of suspicion, in terms of manipulation. And I don't think those kinds of attitudes, those kinds of paradigms will work. I think when we're trying to control each other, when we're lacking the respect that gives dignity to each person in our world, that we end up in destructive kinds of behaviors.
Janelle Burke.
My first question is for Congressman LaRocco, and it deals with this year's passage of civil rights legislation. Could you please, for our viewers, highlight some of the important areas in that legislation, because it was a significant piece?
Well, first of all, we had to pass it twice. It was regrettable that the President did not see fit to sign the first one, calling it a quota bill, when the language specifically in the bill said it was not a quota bill. But you can't take politics out of politics, and so there was a lot of that going on. I think some of it emanated from the Chief of Staff at that time, former Chief of Staff Sununu as well. And but what it really did is that it overturned a couple of Supreme Court cases which really disallowed women to sue an employer for discrimination based on gender. Now, you can sue an employer based on race, disability, But this corrected what the Supreme Court had disallowed. And so it was really a women's rights issue and an equal rights issue, and it allowed women to have access to the courts. Unfortunately, there had to be some compromises struck where the damages were capped at $150,000. We don't do that for anybody else who has access to the courts under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, but we did it here to get the bill passed. But basically, it was a gender issue, and it was right. I voted for it both times, and I'm glad it finally passed.
Well, this is definitely a step forward. Bill, in terms of economics, human rights do make economic sense. Is that correct?
Oh, yes.
These are kind of tied together. We're talking about here human rights, we're talking about women's rights, people's rights. They make economic sense, correct?
Very much so, and I very much support and applaud the Congress for passing that civil rights legislation. But interestingly enough, at our recent conference for the coalition in Boise, we asked Santiago Rodriguez from Apple Computer to come up and speak to presidents of corporations and CEOs who we gathered together from the Boise area for a breakfast. And his message to them was, as presidents of companies, as CEOs of companies, he really encouraged them to move past the legal restraints or the legal forcing, if you want, of civil rights legislation. He really encouraged them to move past EEO regulations, all of that. He said, if you're only concerned about what you have to do in order to meet these law requirements, he said your corporation, your business is ultimately going to go down the drain. Because he said in our interconnected world, with diversity not only in our own society, but diversity around the world, which is so tied together economically and business-wise now, he said that if you do not actively promote a diverse workforce, and if you do not actively support a diverse workforce in your corporation, in your business, you are going to lose a lot of international market and you're going to lose a lot of national market. He basically said your bottom line is what drives you on this issue. If you only respond to what you legally have to, okay, you're obeying the law, and that's a minimum. But you're not going to do your bottom line any good, and ultimately it will cost you. And the CEOs that were there and the presidents of corporations were there, they knew what he was saying, and they agreed with it. We only have to look around very superficially to see that. Microsoft in Seattle, for example, hires internationally. They've built their own little international community around that one corporation. They sell, they market, they utilize the talents of people from around the world, not just United States citizens. The economic community of Europe and the expansion that's happening there, the trade that's starting to happen with what was formerly the USSR. It's very evident that we're so tied together as internationally with the diversity that's there. It's also so evident that diversity in our own country is increasing so rapidly that for a corporation to ignore it is economic suicide.
Bill, I'll start with you this time. You have access to a lot of statistics because there's a lot of organizations that are national that are affiliated as members with the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment and also on the board of directors. Some of those statistics come from organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. Certainly the NAACP has statistics, the Center for Democratic Renewal, Southern Poverty Law Center, and many others. You had indicated the real growth in hate crimes in the Northwest. Again, that is simply reflecting what's going on across the country.
Certainly is.
And so since that is already documented, and now with this new federal legislation on bias crime reporting, I would like to give you the opportunity to explain why you think that there is this rise in crime all over the country directed at people because of race, color, religion, sexual orientation, and certainly violence against women in our society. What is causing this very troubling increase?
I think we're at a period of time in the history of the United States where it's very challenging on the issue of race. We're seeing increased tensions between groups. On the one hand, we see studies that say that the general population is growing more tolerant, an increasing percentage of the population is tolerant each subsequent year. On the other hand, we see things like increased statistics of malicious harassment. I think it's part of the fact that we're in a trying kind of time. There are so many issues that pull at us that those who would tend to see racism as a way of explaining their problems or racist solutions as solutions to problems are starting to utilize those. I think that's why David Duke gets so many votes in Louisiana. I don't believe that there are 35% of the population of Louisiana that's absolute bigots. But I think there is 35% of the population of Louisiana that is so troubled by their economic condition and by the condition of crime and all those sorts of things that they're willing to tolerate somebody who proposes solutions that are racist, and they're willing to put up with that. Unfortunately, I see that around a lot of our country as we face economic recession, as we face increased crime loads. Unfortunately, we were sometimes willing to give up some freedoms and give up some rights, usually not our own, usually the freedoms and rights of somebody else, for the sake of order. Thomas Jefferson, I think, said, if he didn't say it, he should have, said that if we're willing to give up some freedom for the sake of order, we will soon wake up to find out that we have neither. And that's what my concern is with what's happening with David Duke. What's happening around our country is that people are looking in the wrong direction for solutions to the problems. They're looking for racist solutions. They're looking for solutions that divide our country rather than pull us together. And that's going to drive wedges. We need people with some vision, who have a vision of our society pulled together rather than a vision that divides us.
I have a similar question for you, Congressman LaRocco. As you travel around the United States, and you've recently been abroad, what do you think political leaders can do, of both political parties, both on the state and national level, to address what Bill has just discussed? Because, if, like we learned in Germany, if a totalitarian leader gets in power, then rights are no longer there, and it can't even negotiate with that kind of power structure. What do we need to do that we're not doing?
We should deal with the problem of illiteracy in this country. This is a great, grave problem for the United States, and I don't think that Congress and the President are dealing with it forcefully enough. When I went back to Congress, I really wanted to deal with this issue. I don't sit on the right committees to do it, and as I look back in the first year, I have to even do some self-assessment of myself and say that I've got to work harder in this area, and I think that Congress has to work harder. There are 27 million functionally illiterate people in this country. They're going to be the ones who are susceptible to the arguments of David Duke and others, because they're simple arguments, they're simple solutions, they're black and white with no gray area. These people, the David Dukes of the world, are anti-intellectual, which play to the greatest fears of people. And if you can't read and write, if you don't have a sense of history, if you don't have some sort of a literary background, we are doomed to the David Dukes. Now, there are other things that we can do as well. And I think that we can stop the Willie Horton type ads on television. We can bring up campaigning to a new level. And I think the media should help in that regard to hold politicians' feet to the fire. I think that the campaign finance reform bill that was passed in the House goes a long way towards doing this, because it's going to force politicians to get back to their states and their districts, deal with the folks at home, to listen to them and deal in a more direct way. And once you do that, then you won't be putting the negative ads on TV, which are the 30-second attack ads, which do a lot of what Bill just said in terms of simplified messages. So I think that we've got to show some leadership and some vision on this. But this illiteracy issue and this question, I think, is paramount in the United States. And it scares me for economic reasons, as you mentioned earlier, Janelle, that this whole thing has an economic impact, for political reasons and for social reasons. Socially, if you're illiterate, you can't enrich your life or the lives of those around you. Politically, it will lead to more David Dukes. And economically, we will not be able to compete in a very competitive world marketplace if this illiteracy continues in our country, and it's a national disgrace.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
Well, we've talked some about our own country, and I know that you've recently been out of the country visiting Israel. Can you tell us, that's putting us on a world level now of people dealing with other people. What's going on and what's going to happen, if you have any predictions, but really what's going on there, and what did you see when you went there?
Well, I can think of no place in the world where the conflicts are so intense and have such a history to them, nowhere except in the Middle East. But I have to say that I was very optimistic after my visit there, that even though there are daily tensions that continue, the Lebanese border is active every night. There are incursions into Israel almost on a daily basis, and the Israelis feel compelled to deal with that. There have been recent deportations by the Israelis of Arabs, and then they were condemned in the Security Council, soundly condemned and roundly condemned. But with all of these things going on, and some tensions within the Arab sector of Jerusalem and in the West Bank, I looked in the Prime Minister's eyes, and Shamir said to me, he said, watch what we do in the negotiations, because I challenged him to say some of the actions that go on a day-to-day basis don't look like the Israelis really want peace. And he said, watch what we do. And sure enough, a few days after we returned, they were indeed at the negotiation table. And I think that they are going to be able to make progress on a bilateral basis, for example, with Jordan, on areas where there can be agreement. One nuance is to watch the developments on water resources and how they deal with this. And I think that they could do that. I don't think it's going to be a direct territory for peace type of settlement in the long run, but I think that things can be worked out, and that the freedoms and the rights of Palestinians in the West Bank can be protected. I'm very optimistic about what's going on. The Israelis said that they want to move the peace process to the Middle East. They said that it was successful during the relations and the negotiations with the Egyptians. And they said that way they could shuttle information back and forth without having the security difficulties. And that's where they want to move. Sometimes things seem to have to get worse before they get better. But I think in the Middle East, after talking to Sharon, after talking to Shamir, and talking to various journalists there, I'm optimistic. And if we can do that in the Middle East, then we can solve the wilderness problem here in Idaho.
And just very quickly, Bill, what's new? You're right in the center of everything that's happening in regard to these human rights issues. What's the very latest and newest ideas, and what's really going on, the very latest?
I think there's a lot of exciting things going on. I think one of the real exciting things that's happened nationally just very recently is the Southern Poverty Law Center has begun an education project. And they've developed a twice-a-year booklet, size of Time magazine, for example. And the first edition of that just went out. They send it free to any schools that want it throughout the country. They just bulk mailed it to like 150,000 schools, some number like that. And ones that didn't get it can simply ask for it and get that whole operation. I think that kind of intrusion, if you want, of materials on reducing bigotry, and it's learning tolerance, that's what it's about. It's very directly connected to the issue of racism and bigotry. On that elementary school level is just a real exciting kind of development. I see in the Northwest more and more communities of people who are coming together and who are saying not only no to supremacist activity, but are saying we got some work to do in our communities. So we got some work to do to really see this diversity that's existing and growing here as being valuable. So I see a lot of grassroots stuff happening that's very exciting.
I have to interrupt at this point. I want to thank both Congressman Larry LaRocco and Mr. Bill Watson of the Northwest Coalition for their appearance and all their contributions today on our campus, and Janelle Burke for her fine questions. And I would certainly say that if Dr. Martin Luther King was speaking today, I think he would be very pleased with the process that's going on in the communities to deal with the celebration and reminding us what human rights is. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our program today and that you'll be with us again next week at the same time when we will discuss what we believe to be a significant issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.